It's been about 4 months since I set up the Megaflex, and it's been about 10 months since I worked on the heavily modified 15-gallon Flex upstairs. I thought I'd take a few minutes today and tell you about both these tanks and kind of give you an update, let you know what I think, and talk about the progress I've made. That's all coming up right after this. Hey YouTube, this is Pecktec, and of course, I'm sitting here in front of what has become my new favorite tank. It's the Megaflex.
Megaflex!
Where's that come from? I have to say, this tank's been a real surprise because a lot of times when I set up tanks, I have this really awkward period where the algae gets kind of terrible and the plants don't grow, and I've had a lot of issues. I had almost none of those issues with this tank. I want to find some wood and knock on it. But this one's been a really different experience for me. I've got to say, I really love the Megaflex. I like it probably, I'd say many times more than just the 15-gallon. So if you're considering the 15-gallon, or maybe you're torn between the 15 and the 32, always go bigger. It's just going to be a better experience. I have to say the biggest improvement with the Megaflex over the regular 15-gallon Flex is the lights. The integration of the app with the Wi-Fi that will let the lights kind of gradually go up and then gradually go down, and the ability to add a second light if you're a plant enthusiast versus just a fish-only guy. Fish-only, one light is just fine, of course. 2 lights if you have plants, and that really helps. It really helps distribute the light evenly all the way from the front to the back. It is a little bit more narrow right in the middle, but there are big areas in the back that probably wouldn't get much light if you only had the one and it was towards the front. After I added the fish, of course, I started to see a little bit more algae, but it's this kind of weird, it's not blackbeard algae and it's not hair algae, it's this weird kind of black gelatinous algae it's really slick to the touch. And usually what I do is I'll just cut off the end of the leaf or whatever it's attached to and try to suck it up right away. You can pluck it out with your fingers too, but it's kind of a pain. But I haven't had a whole lot of it, just a little bit, and in fact it was enough to kind of just ignore for a while. Now part of the reason I don't have algae is probably because I'm like way oversaturated with Amano shrimp. If you guys remember when I broke down the 20-gallon, I used this as my ark. I took all the fish, I saved them by putting them in here and made this their new permanent home. As it turns out, it was really, all the fish that were there were appropriate for this tank too. And I just kind of matched the environments the best I could, and then I just kind of moved them over. For the most part, they've all been okay. But one thing I've noticed is that I've got a whole lot of Amano shrimp. I was fighting a really big algae problem in the 20-gallon at different amounts at different times as it evolved over the years. And Amano shrimp are really hardy and not always apparent how many there are until you actually take everything out. Basically, when I moved them over to this, I have a TARDIS ornament, and as I caught them, they all hid inside that ornament. And I just took the ornament up with all the water in it and I set it right in here. And eventually they all kind of came out. The thing I'm learning about Amano shrimp is although they're really good, they're pretty aggressive. And I think in the adult ones, some of these are more than a decade old. There's a couple of these Amano shrimp that are the oldest fish that I own. I don't know if they're the oldest, but they're definitely in the running. I've got 3 fish in particular that seem to have survived through every aquarium that I've had. So they're really long-lived, and yet I've bought, 10 or 15 of them at least, and a lot of them have survived. I think all of them have survived. So in my opinion, there's probably a few too many Amanos in here. I just say that because especially the large ones get very aggressive with the food. I've seen them jump on other fish and just rip food out of their mouth and then take off into the back there to munch on it by itself. So they're real aggressive in a lot of ways and kind of big animals in general. So I will probably go ahead and migrate a few of these by taking the TARDIS back out because they congregate in there. I don't know what it is. They really like the TARDIS. So And what's funny is when I put it, or initially when I put it into the aquarium that I had it in before, it was covered in algae, and now it's like just picked clean. It's like one of the cleanest ornaments you've ever seen. So I might take that TARDIS, pluck it back out of there, and put it in upstairs and just see how many Amanos travel with it. One plant I added afterwards is this sort of red colored plant, or I've got two plants that have sort of a red hue, especially as they get closer to the lights. Unfortunately, this plant here, I bought it a while back from Jennifer Williams at a show, and I cannot remember what the name of it is. I saved it. It was like a tiny little sprout, and I put it in the 20-gallon with CO2 and some good lights, and I really started getting it to grow quite a bit. Eventually, some of the other plants took over, and it started to die back a little bit. But I had a good amount of it when I set this tank up, and I brought it down because I like the green, and I've tried to go for a lot of different flavors of green, different hues of green, but also different shapes and textures. I've got the curly Vesuvius sword, and I've got the kind of the more pale and flat Anubias, and then I've got the dark green from the crypts. And all of those leaf structures are really different, but I really wanted another color in there besides green and brown and black. So having not only this like really interesting kind of needle leaf texture in there, but also the colors, I think really add to the aquascape and make it that much more interesting visually. When I initially set up this aquascape, my goal was for a really, really dense area on this side because I've got windows back here and it gets a fair amount of natural light. Also, initially I'd set this tank up. If you look at the unboxing, I had it on the other side of my wall. I decided to take this bookcase and kind of place it strategically over here to kind of help block off some of that light. And the second thing I did was also to, just plant really densely on this side, and it kind of shields the rest of the tank. Sometimes you get a little bit more algae when you do that on the plants over here, but for some reason it just hasn't been a big issue. The substrate that I'm using, along with some plant tabs, really seem to have set the Vesuvius sword off. I've had to cut it back several times to try and keep it from just taking over. If I had replanted all the stems that had come over, it would already be halfway across the tank. Of course, I planted the bottom of this with that crypt parv that I pulled out of the 55-gallon upstairs. I had this incredible amount of it. When I pulled it out of the 55, I had no idea it had grown in so thick. I mean, it was everywhere. I was really shocked because it didn't seem like that much of a patch up there. But when I brought it down, it covered everything. And I think I even put it in a couple of other tanks as well. But it grows very slow. Even separated, even like this, it grows super slow. So it's going to take a long time for it to really thicken up. But I think if it does, it'll be gorgeous. So I got to keep the stem plants from just kind of mowing over everything and taking it over. If I get a really good specimen coming off here, what I'll do is I'll replant it around back and just make it try to grow back in, from another direction. Also, when you trim off those runners, it slows it down quite a bit. Sometimes they even die if you trim the runners too soon. But it's better than having them just kind of wander out. Another reddish hue plant that I've got is one that I actually pulled out of the face tank from the Let's Face It video. And it's another plant that I can't quite remember the name of. You see, the thing is, for a while I was getting plants from H2O Plants. He did the plant pack, and I was getting these monthly packs of plants. And I was like, I've got a lot of plant aquariums, but eventually I had to stop because I just didn't have enough projects to keep up with the amount of plants I was getting. Plus, a fair amount of them lived, so that generated even more plants. So you kind of, if you plant a tank and it's real successful, you kind of started a little mini farm, and you're going to always have a lot of that plant. There's a lot of plants here. This Crypt Wendetti, I haven't had to buy Crypt Wendetti in more than 10 years. I've always got some of it in a tank somewhere. The same is true with most of my Anubias and other plants like that. If you can just kind of keep it going, if you save even the smallest little bit of it, even if most of it's all covered with algae and dead, and you just clip off the end of it that still looks all right and throw it in another tank. Grow it up, and you'll have a nice plant one day. you just got to be patient. You got to be willing to like jam these things in the corner and just kind of try to forget about it until you notice that it's blossomed into something better. I'm not sure I don't have any single thing to point to as far as like what helped me succeed in keeping this algae free, keeping it, hair algae free, especially. Hair algae is like the bane of my existence. But I did do some kind of weird, unorthodox things that I don't normally do in my tanks. And one was, this didn't actually get a water change, a direct water change from the sink. My normal procedure is I take a python, I attach it to the sink, and I add dechlorinator as I add dechlorinator as I pour water. I'll use the python to suck it out, then I'll add some dechlorinator as I'm filling it up. And that's how I've done my water changes for years for all my tanks. But with this and my other tanks down here as well, I did something really different. We're getting all this evaporation, so my pond would evaporate down really, really fast. I live in East Tennessee, and we have very, very humid summers. So my pond was just evaporating down to the point where I was having to refill it at least, twice a week. So what I was doing is I just kind of run a siphon from this tank out to the pond, and I siphon off some water there. I do it about, I usually do 20% water changes. I haven't measured what exactly 20% is, so I take it down about at least a quarter of the way down. Sometimes even more, probably closer to 50%. But I take about, a quarter to 50% of the water out, and I put it into the pond. And then I would just take water from the 200 gallon, and I would siphon it into here. Then I started taking, I'd take water out of the 27 gallon cube behind me. I would take water out of that and put it in the yard or the pond. If my pond fills up, I just throw it in the yard under a tree or something else. And I was draining all my tanks into the yard, and then I was refilling them out of the 200 gallon, and then I was taking my tap water from the sink and then filling up the 200 gallon. So everything down here was getting drained into the yard or my pond, and then the 200 gallon was the water source for everything else. Then it would just get a water change. Now, as far as beneficial bacteria goes, no, there's no beneficial bacteria in the water column. There is the stuff that beneficial bacteria is eating, though. So I think carrying over water from a heavily populated tank to basically an empty tank that just had plants in it, I'd added some seasoned ceramic material in here from the other tank. So if I hadn't added fish or something else, then it would have nothing to eat and all the bacteria would die very quickly. It's going to have some stuff to eat from the plant matter that passes away. Usually when you use soil in the bottom, you've got that spike of ammonia, which would be maybe a food source for some of the beneficial bacteria. But by often pulling water from an established tank over here, not only is it degassed, aged, and anything that benefits the water from being aged for a while, but it's also got some of whatever's floating around in there that the beneficial bacteria are eating. It provides it to this tank without actually putting fish in here. So it's not a constant source, but it is a source. Now, I'm not a biologist, and I can't tell you exactly, to what degree that helped, but to me it helped a tremendous amount. And when I added fish in here from the other tank, I checked very carefully. I added quite a bit of fish at once. I also added beneficial bacteria, just like I normally would. I upped my water changes for a bit just after that to kind of help too. But I never got a huge spike in ammonia. I never had a real problem. The fish have been sort of stress-free from day one, as far as I can tell, just from visually inspecting them. So it all could be consequential, but it really feels like that helped a lot. And if you're in a similar situation where you've got a really large aquarium surrounded by many smaller aquariums, you might want to give it a try, especially if you're already having maybe an issue with algae or something else. Of course, I did all of this along with water tests and stuff. The main thing I was worried about was maybe nitrates kind of getting out of hand using used water. This benefited from getting a little bit more water changes than it usually does. These benefited from the aged water, and the yard benefited from just random water from my aquariums, which are really healthy for the plants and everything else going on up there. Now, as far as the plants go, it seems like they're growing really well. They're growing at the right pace that I enjoy, where they're coming up and they're kind of still easy to trim, but they're not just taking over. There's no CO2 in this tank at all. And as far as the light cycle goes, it's hard to describe because it's part of that Fluval app. In fact, I'll just open it and we'll take a look. There's two separate lights in here. You can copy the program from one light to another light, so it'll perfectly mimic it and they'll work the same. Or you can differentiate them a little bit if you want maybe one light to dim out a little sooner than the other one to kind of cut back on light in certain areas. Really get granular with it, you can. So this is my program on the app, and this is what the app looks like. And I really have this on for a long time during the day, a lot longer than I normally would. It comes on at 9 o'clock in the morning, and so it's got a sunrise feature where it's going to ramp up, right? So it ramps up from 9 o'clock till 12 o'clock, and when it hits the top, it's I've got 100% on the red, green, blue, and white. Then it starts at sunset from 1,800 hours to 2,100 hours. Okay, what's 1,800 hours? Then from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, it gradually goes down. Now, one thing I've got to say, like when you compare it to the Kessels, like this is on a program along with the big tank that you can't see over here. These things get to about 25% power and then they cut off. These things seem to get very, very dim. I'm talking maybe, it's got to be maybe 5% of their normal light output or lower, and then it finally goes out. The last part, when it goes dimmer, dimmer, dimmer down, I mean, that part goes pretty quick, but it gets really dim, and you notice it. I mean, you can see it. It's something that's kind of hard to capture on film, but it's really neat the way it works, and it's definitely interesting. I think the fish really like it. I think the plants react a little bit better, maybe a little bit more naturally to it. You could even experiment too if this was your only tank and you wanted to think about it a whole lot. You could change your light cycle to match whatever time of year it is. Like right now, and probably it's early in the evening and yet it's pitch black outside. This tank has been a terrific experience and a lot of fun. But I want to talk about my 15-gallon upstairs. It's like I forgot about it almost. Now, I've been planning for a long time to do an update on the Megaflex because it's so new and it's really interesting. But I did another tank almost a year ago now. It was right at the end of last year. I set up the Blackwater Fluval Flex. I did quotes for the Blackwater because I never went full Blackwater with it. I couldn't bring myself to like tanning that thing up so much that you couldn't see through it. I wanted to put plants in there, and then it just kind of got out of hand. So now so I have a lot of botanicals in there, and I've been keeping up with I will boil up some fresh ones when they get too nasty and kind of swap them out. And I think my fish have really enjoyed having those things to swim around, and I think the botanicals are really, really visually interesting, like much more interesting than rocks. If you're going to do a tank without plants in it, especially, instead of sticking tons of rocks in there, there's all these pods and really interesting different things that have a lot more to offer, I think, visually than just stonework. Or it could work with stonework to make it even more natural and interesting looking. I wasn't sure I'd feel about acorns and leaves and things like that being placed into the tank, but I've really grown to love it. I think it makes a huge difference in how natural a tank looks. It doesn't make it seem as cluttery or as dirty as I thought it would, and adds much more than I thought it would. So it's been an interesting time trying to incorporate more and more of that. Of course, usually with my planted tanks, all the spare, any spot that's flat, I want a plant coming up out of it. I'll have rocks and wood and stuff like that, but if you notice in a lot of my aquariums, the wood gets lost, after a year or so. You can't even tell there's wood in there. This has held its own pretty good. And the one upstairs has worked pretty well. It kind of started me down this trend that I've done this year, which is basically make a knot out of wood and then put as many plants as you can in there and let them kind of grow out of it. That was kind of the strategy that I went with upstairs, and I wanted one side of it to be kind of densely planted, and then kind of around the front, and then off to the side where I would more than likely be looking at it. I wanted that to be more open so the fish would kind of congregate there. Now, if you're new to the channel, you might notice that this flex is quite different than the run-of-the-mill flex. For one, I've added a glass top, which I love a whole lot. It is so much more interesting than having the black on the top. I don't mind it so much here because there's a lot more to look at, but upstairs it really adds like a whole nother dimension to the tank. I think it's really great. The other thing I added upstairs is a Kessel light. I initially had added the old one that I pulled off of here, and then when I replaced the big lights over there, I put a nicer one up there. So it's not the very newest, but it's still a pretty new Kessel light. And I don't have another timer or anything. The Kessel has a special timer that lets you like ramp them up and back down. I don't have that on there. It's just on a simple on-off timer. I run the light for about 7 hours on that tank. And the thing with that tank too, it also has not had a really huge algae problem. Now, much like this one, I added a lot of plants when I initially planted it, and I think that helps a lot. I also waited a very long time before I added fish. And what's neat is if you're just patient with it and really think about it, you can take your time, and when you come across some fish that you've always wanted or you really like, maybe a little species tank, you've kind of got one set up. If you wait till your plants are growing, especially if they're growing pretty well, you can add some beneficial bacteria along with a new fish without like really triggering a huge cycle. The fish I eventually put in there are the Checkerboard cichlids, and I gotta say that they are really, really beautiful fish. They're so much more pretty than I even thought that they would be. So when I was looking them up before I brought them home to see if I would want to keep them, I saw a couple of pictures, but I think I saw adolescents in the photos. And when I saw how different the fins were, I thought I was looking at a different fish. Like I really thought I made a mistake, and maybe this is one species and this is what I've got is obviously another species, but no. As they grew, their fins grew also, and they turned into this really, really beautiful fish that I didn't know they were going to be. It'd be really neat if they would breed in there. I really don't think it's going to happen. I'm not like going for that either, but I'm always hopeful. Eventually, when I broke down the 55, I decided to add in all my neon tetras, or their green neon tetras. There's quite a few of them in that tank, but you don't see them very often because they kind of pop in and out of that big knot that I made in the middle. They all hide inside of there, and very often after you add some food, if you kind of hang back a little bit and watch, you'll see them kind of emerge out of that knot and start to eat the food. It's pretty cool. And there's about 8 or 9 of them in there. So that's a tank that doesn't look very full, but it is actually quite full. It also has a number of cherry red shrimp and a couple of Amano shrimp in there too, because I like Amano shrimp, apparently. That one's had more traditional water changes, no more than like 20% at a time. And I generally pull the water out, then I add it from the sink along with some dechlorinator. No CO2 in this one either. Really the plants that I've added, if you just put a decent light in there and maybe some root tabs or enough fish to fertilize it, then it does all right. I added a bunch of buse as an experiment in this tank too, to see if the nice Kessel light in combination with maybe burying some of it. I didn't have much luck though. It hasn't died, but it hasn't really grown. So far, my best luck growing buse has been in an aqua soil type product with CO2 and decent light. I've tried attaching it to things. I've tried putting it in the ground. I've tried it under dim light. I've tried it under bright light. But the addition of CO2 really turned a corner as far as like growing the buse. But it's been a great tank. It's really beautiful to look at. Unfortunately, it's got a big scratch. I scratched it at some point trying to clean it, and that kind of bothers me to look at it. So, and whenever a tank's scratched, for me, it's like it's on its way out. So I'm not sure how long I'll keep it going, but right now it's lovely. It's a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed keeping it too. Not as much as this one. Definitely, if you're on the fence between this one and the other one, if you just don't have space for it, it's one thing. But it's really not. It's just two, right? If you have space enough for one, it's just a little bit bigger. And that little bit bigger really made a huge difference as far as like what you can do with an aquascape, making it a long flowing aquascape. And small fish that we tend to keep in here too, a lot of them are schooling fish, and they like to move back and forth together. For this tank, I've got a combination of ember tetras, I've got gold ring danios, as well as just dozens and dozens of cherry red shrimp, and another dozen Amano shrimp at least. I've still got a nice tiny school, maybe 5 or 6 of the pygmy cory cats, which I really love. And I've got the peacock gudgeons that, of course, came from a combination of the steampunk tank and the 20-gallon tank upstairs. And last but not least, there's the giant Otto that's in here. Because of him, I haven't added anything else that eats off-flocks grazers, or anything that eats, off the surfaces of everything. I've kind of left it all for him and all these shrimp, of course. But he does a great job of keeping the tank clean, and he's always shows up down here for a little bit of algae at the end of the day. But that's it. They've both been great tanks. I had kind of a hard time using the stock Fluval Flex 15. I tried it with the lid for a long time. It just didn't seem to grow my plants very well. I had some issues with the back, with like my small fish kind of going into the back. That's another thing that kind of came up with this one too, is it's got vents in the back, and a lot of people were worried, but it actually is a little bit safer because those vents go to this little chamber. Then that chamber has another area where the water passes through. So it's got a little bit of a buffer. They don't go into the vents and then they're immediately, in the filter at that point. There's a little bit of a buffer zone. And I think that kind of helps. Now, the only thing that's really going to pass around back and forth through here is the cherry shrimp. And I don't mind so much if they go back in there and kind of play around near where the filter is and then come back out. I've got so many that if occasionally one or two wanders like too far into the filter and gets impelled, then they do. But it hasn't been the case. My population has only grown since they've been in here. They've got lots of other places to go besides the filter, huge dark areas in the back, and that goes for all these fish. I see them all the time because they can hide at any given moment. There's so many spots in here for them to hide and explore. And the same's true upstairs. So it's really important, if you don't have hides and stuff in your aquarium, that you at least have really densely planted areas where things can kind of run and hide in. I've seen absolutely zero casualties as far as like in the filter compartment or anything back there where the pump pumps out the water. It's just not been an issue at all. This week I'm giving away another Penguin 375 Pro, and let's get one. Don't forget to comment down below for your chance to win a Penguin 375 Pro. I've got 2 more of these to give out, this one and another one. And in a couple of weeks, I'll be giving away the 2 polishing filters together in one video, so there'll be 2 winners for that particular week, but that one we'll do last. The rules are really simple for that. Just make a comment on this video. I'll be picking a winner probably Saturday of next week. Big congratulations to last week's winner, who's right here. When the person does win, I'm going to pin their comment down at the top. So if you look at the top of the comments and you see no pinned comment, you could win this filter. So you should definitely leave a comment. Say something nice and maybe get a filter. People have been telling me their stories on there, telling me about how they could really use one and all that. You can apply to my sympathy all you want. I'm going to be using a randomized program to pick the thing. There will be no emotion involved. It'll be cold computer hands selecting your name from fate. Holly thought that was funny. So until next time, follow your bliss, keep a clean tank, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Hey folks, it's been about... Hey YouTube, this... Say if you're going to put plants in, you definitely want to get the... Same's true with most of my I'm actually not sure what can... And I'd added some biological material in there. I added some used... And I added some good... No! Stop calling me! This is telemarketer. Like, you're screwed. No one's ever answering you.